Hi, kids. Here we are back again. We read about the various kind of first half of the war stuff, and now following the D-Day invasion, uh, where American forces, along with the British and the Canadians, invaded the continent of Europe and France uh, in the summer of 1944. Over the course of the summer of 1944 in the fall, they liberated France and pushed the Germans out. And that gets us to the biggest battle of the war in Europe for the United States, which was known as the Battle of the Bulge, fought December, January of 1944 and 1945, right around Christmas and New Year's of that particular year. And it started out as something that people didn't even think really could happen because everyone kind of thought the war was pretty much over at that point, but that was not the case. So let's take a look at what happened in the Battle of the Bulge, and if you could, please follow along while I read. World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. Beg, borrow, or steal ammunition, but defend this area. The breakout. In the late summer of 1944, the Allies finally broke out of the savage fighting in Normandy following the D-Day invasion. Operation Cobra was launched on July 25, 1944, beginning with an aerial bombardment of thousands of planes that destroyed an entire German division. The destruction of German resistance in that area opened a gap that the U.S. First Army rushed through. For the first time since the D-Day invasion 7 weeks before, the U.S. Army was able to strike hard and fast as they had been trained to do. The Americans were fully motorized, unlike the Germans, who still often used horses and wagons to move equipment from place to place. Because of this, the U.S. Army of 1944 was able to practice blitzkrieg-style warfare better than the Germans ever dreamed of doing. Within weeks, German resistance in France crumbled, Paris was liberated, and huge amounts of territory in France fell into Allied hands. On the edge. As Christmas 1944 approached, the Allies were poised to enter Germany. France was now in Allied hands. The Americans were now settled in the Ardennes forest in Belgium, catching their breath before what seemed sure to be the final push into Germany to end the war in Europe. German resistance appeared to be almost non-existent. The war was far from over, though. While much of the German army defending France was destroyed, a new German army was being put together and trained, unknown to the Americans. This force was made up of new German recruits, older men earlier passed over for service, and most importantly, frontline units transferred from the Russian front. This last group included several divisions of Waffen-SS soldiers whom most Americans had never faced in battle up to this point. And there you see a photo of a soldier from the Waffen-SS fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. This guy, while I don't know his particular story, almost certainly this guy had spent plenty of time fighting in the Soviet Union, probably since way back in 1941. So he was very experienced and also was very familiar with how brutal that war was on that side of the world, and was perfectly willing to be just as brutal in his dealings with the Americans. The Waffen-SS had a well-deserved reputation for fighting fanatically against their enemies and also ruthless cruelty towards civilians. When they faced the Americans in France, they eagerly applied the lessons of brutality they learned fighting the Soviets since 1941. They were superbly trained and supplied with the latest German weapons, which were often superior to American and British weapons. The Allies thought the war was all but over, but the Germans were ready to strike back in Western Europe. They came out of nowhere. They slaughtered us. When the German army launched their attack in the Ardennes forest in December 1944, they were on familiar ground. The Ardennes was the exact spot the Germans broke through British and French lines in 1940. This led to their blitzkrieg conquest of France, the French surrender, and the British evacuation at Dunkirk. The Germans attacked the U.S. 106th and 99th Infantry Divisions in Belgium, which had been in combat for weeks. The men of those units were exhausted and were placed in a supposedly quiet part of the line to rest, refit, and get replacements for the men lost in earlier battles. Instead, those divisions were annihilated. Thousands who could not get away were taken prisoner. The Waffen-SS troops who captured them massacred the American prisoners, as was common in their experience fighting the war in the Soviet Union. It had never been done against Americans in Europe, though. From that point forward, American soldiers rarely took Waffen-SS soldiers alive if they found themselves in combat with them. The Red Ball Express. When news of the German breakthrough reached the Allied headquarters, the U.S. Army switched into high gear to stop the attack. All American units were immediately dispatched to the front to plug the holes as they occurred. One thing German attack planners underestimated was the speed in which the U.S. Army could react. Unlike their army or the British and French armies in 1940, the U.S. Army in 1944 was totally mechanized. They could get men and equipment wherever they were needed faster than any other force in the world. One unit that answered the call was U.S. Army truck drivers. They'd been in constant use since D-Day, ferrying supplies across France. The unit picked up their nickname, the Red Ball Express, named for the red circles that emblazoned their trucks, indicating they were allowed to use any road in France without question. The Express was once again pressed into service to get men to the front to stop the Germans in Belgium. The Red Ball Express was composed almost totally of African American drivers and earned a special unit citation for their service during the Battle of the Bulge. And there you see a few members of the Red Ball Express, an African American unit in World War II. Very quickly, it became apparent that the most important spot at the front was the Belgian town of Bastogne, which had 7 roads leading through it. German tanks and artillery needed to pass through Bastogne if they were going to move further into France. The American 101st Airborne Division, the all-African American 969th Artillery Battalion, and the 7th Armored Division were sent to Bastogne with clear orders: hold the Germans there until reinforcements arrived. The bastards of Bastogne. The American units in Bastogne were completely surrounded. They were short of food, winter clothing, ammunition, and lacked artillery or air support. They had orders, though, and they knew that defeat at Bastogne might cause the war to be extended by years. The screaming eagles of the 101st dug in. Living in holes in the ground in the coldest part of the winter, the 101st, the 969th Artillery, and the 7th Armored held out for a month in terrible conditions under German shell fire until they were relieved by the U.S. Third Army. At that point, while there was still a great deal of fighting over the next 6 weeks around the Bulge that the Germans pushed into the American line, the Germans no longer advanced any further. The Battle of the Bulge was the biggest battle of World War II for the USA. And there you see a map of kind of this bulge that the Germans kind of pushed into the American line. They never actually broke it. They came very, very close, but that kind of bent back, and then the Americans were able to respond and kind of even that back out again. But that's where the Battle of the Bulge gets its name. And from this point forward, there was still some heavy fighting to go, but this was kind of the last biggest gasp of the German army. It was their last best shot to try and turn the war around, and it came close to succeeding, but it did not.